The avoidant thought they knew empaths, patient people who would absorb their coldness, who would make excuses for their distance, who would stay through treatment that would make others leave. The avoidant has dated empaths before, and the pattern was predictable. The empath would give and understand and accommodate until they were completely depleted. And by the time they finally left, they'd be so diminished that the avoidant could watch them go without much impact. But this time was different. This time the avoidant encountered something they weren't prepared for. A super empath. Someone with all the empathy and understanding and patience of a regular empath, but with one crucial addition. Boundaries that don't negotiate, self-respect that doesn't bend, and the capacity to leave while they're still strong enough to leave devastation in their wake. The super empath saw through every defense the avoidant had, understood exactly what wounds were driving the behavior, gave the avoidant chances to do better, and then left with such finality and clarity that it broke something in the avoidant that will never fully repair. The lesson the super empath taught wasn't delivered through words or ultimatums or emotional appeals. It was delivered through perfect execution of boundaries, through the surgical precision of someone who understands you completely and chooses themselves anyway, through the shocking experience of being truly seen and still being rejected, because being seen clearly meant being understood as fundamentally incapable. What makes the super empath different from the regular empath is they never lost themselves in trying to save the avoidant. Regular empaths get so focused on understanding the avoidant's wounds that they forget their own needs. They make the avoidant's healing their project, their purpose, their reason for staying. But the super empath understood the avoidant's wounds while maintaining crystal clarity that those wounds were not their responsibility to heal. The super empath offered grace and patience and understanding, but all of it came with expiration date that was invisible to the avoidant until it expired. And when it expired, when the super empath decided that understanding the avoidant's limitations didn't mean accepting mistreatment from those limitations, the departure was so clean and so final that the avoidant is still trying to process what happened. They thought they were dealing with someone they could control through their usual tactics: withdrawal, hot and cold, breadcrumbs. They discovered too late they were dealing with someone playing an entirely different game, someone who was documenting every failure, noting every pattern, and building a case for their own departure that became airtight before the avoidant realized they were on trial. The harsh lesson the super empath taught is this: empathy is not the same as tolerance for mistreatment. Understanding someone's damage doesn't mean accepting being damaged by them. And being patient doesn't mean being available indefinitely for someone who won't do their work. The avoidant built their entire relational strategy on people confusing these things. On empaths thinking that understanding meant staying, that patience meant waiting forever, that seeing their wounds meant healing those wounds for them. The super empath understood all of it and left anyway. And the leaving taught the avoidant that their deepest fear was actually true. Someone can see all of them, understand all of them, know exactly why they are the way they are, and still decide they're not worth the cost. The lesson is permanent because the super empath left while the avoidant still wanted them. Left while the relationship still felt salvageable to the avoidant. Left before they were diminished enough that losing them was easy. The avoidant is haunted by this loss in ways they've never been haunted before, because this time they lost someone who actually understood them. And being understood and still being left is the most damning judgment the avoidant will ever receive. What the super empath saw that regular empaths miss. The super empath saw the avoidance patterns not as wounds to heal, but as choices being made repeatedly. Regular empaths see the avoidant pull away and think they're scared of intimacy because of their childhood. The super empath saw the same pulling away and thought they're scared of intimacy, they understand they're scared, they're choosing not to address that fear through therapy. And their choice not to address it is choice to keep hurting people. The distinction is everything. Regular empaths get trapped thinking the avoidant can't help their behavior because of their trauma. The super empath understood that trauma explains behavior without excusing it, and that adults are responsible for getting help for their trauma rather than expecting partners to absorb the consequences of unhealed wounds. The super empath watched the avoidant choose their defended state over and over, choose withdrawal over vulnerability, choose comfort over growth, choose familiar fear over unfamiliar healing. And each choice the avoidant made not to be different was data point the super empath collected, evidence building toward inevitable conclusion that this person was choosing their patterns over the relationship. The super empath also saw something crucial that regular empaths don't see. They saw the avoidance awareness. The avoidant wasn't unconsciously enacting patterns they didn't understand. They knew what they were doing. They knew when they were being cold. They knew when they were creating distance. They knew their hot and cold behavior was confusing and painful. The super empath could tell the avoidant knew because of how strategic the behavior was, how the avoidant would pull back at exactly the moments when intimacy deepened, how they'd go cold precisely when vulnerability was required. The knowing meant the avoidant was choosing the behavior, and choosing behavior that hurts people while understanding you're hurting them is not trauma response. It's character issue. The super empath saw this distinction clearly. They understood the avoidant had trauma, and they also understood the avoidant was using that trauma as shield against accountability. And seeing both things simultaneously, the wounds and the weaponizing of those wounds, made the super empath's eventual departure not just justified, but necessary. The super empath saw the pattern across time in ways that regular empaths don't track. Regular empaths respond to each incident individually. The avoidant is cold, the empath is hurt, the avoidant offers minimal explanation or apology. The empath forgives, repeat. Each cycle is treated as isolated event, but the super empath was tracking the pattern across all the cycles. They noticed that the apologies never led to changed behavior. They observed that the promises to do better were never accompanied by therapy or actual effort to be different. They documented that the cycles were getting shorter, less time between the avoidance moments of warmth and their inevitable withdrawal. The pattern recognition allowed the super empath to predict exactly where things were heading, to see that the relationship was not getting better and would never get better because the avoidant was fundamentally incapable of sustaining intimacy without intensive therapeutic intervention they refused to pursue. The super empath wasn't making decisions based on hope or potential. They were making decisions based on data, and the data was conclusive. This person will not change, and staying means accepting this treatment indefinitely. The super empath also saw what the avoidant was getting from the relationship and recognized the profound imbalance. The avoidant was receiving unconditional understanding, endless patience, emotional support, consistent presence, someone who saw past their defenses to their worth. The super empath was receiving breadcrumbs, inconsistency, emotional unavailability, the anxiety of never knowing where they stood, the exhaustion of doing all the relationship work. The super empath saw this imbalance clearly and understood it wasn't sustainable, wasn't fair, wasn't actually relationship at all, but rather servitude disguised as partnership. Regular empaths see the imbalance but feel guilty for naming it, worry they're being selfish for wanting reciprocity, convince themselves that giving without receiving is what love looks like. The super empath saw the imbalance and understood that real love involves mutual giving, that partnerships require both people contributing, that accepting one-sided dynamic is not noble. It's self-abandonment. The exact moment the super empath's patience ended, the super empath's patience didn't end because of one big incident. It ended because of accumulation, data points collecting until the weight of evidence became undeniable. There was specific moment, when something shifted internally. Maybe the avoidant pulled away for the 15th time, and the super empath felt something different than hurt. They felt clarity. Or maybe the avoidant made another promise to do better, and the super empath heard the promise and knew with complete certainty it was lie, not because the avoidant was intentionally lying, but because the avoidant had no intention of doing the work that doing better would require. Or maybe the super empath looked at themselves in mirror and didn't recognize who they'd become in trying to accommodate the avoidant's limitations, saw how much of themselves they'd suppressed, and understood that staying meant permanent loss of self. Whatever the specific trigger, there was a moment when the super empath's orientation toward the avoidant fundamentally changed. They stopped hoping, they stopped believing in potential, they stopped seeing the relationship as something that could work if they just tried harder. They saw it clearly as something that was destroying them, while not transforming the avoidant at all. The shift from patience to departure happened faster than the avoidant expected, because the super empath had been doing internal work the avoidant wasn't aware of. While the avoidant thought the super empath was just continuing to absorb their dysfunction like they'd always absorbed it, the super empath was actually building exit strategy. They were getting themselves financially independent if there were entanglements. They were strengthening their support system. They were finding therapists to help them process the relationship and prepare for leaving. They were reading about trauma bonds and avoidant attachment and codependency to understand the dynamics they were trapped in. They were building themselves back up after the relationship had diminished them. All of this was happening below the surface while they maintained the appearance of continuing to try. And when the internal work was complete, when the super empath was strong enough and clear enough and supported enough to leave, they did so with speed that shocked the avoidant. One day the super empath was there, accommodating and understanding. The next day they were gone, completely and irrevocably. The speed of the departure was possible because the decision had been building for months. The avoidant just hadn't been paying attention to the signs. The ending also came faster because the super empath stopped explaining. Regular empaths keep explaining to the avoidant what they need, keep articulating how the avoidant's behavior hurts them, keep hoping that better explanation will finally make the avoidant understand and change. But the super empathy understood that the avoidant already understood they'd been told clearly and repeatedly what needed to change. Continuing to explain was waste of energy because the issue wasn't the avoidant's lack of understanding. The issue was the avoidant's lack of willingness to do what understanding required. So the super empath stopped explaining and started executing. They stopped having conversations about what needed to change and started changing what they would accept, which ultimately meant changing their availability entirely. The shift from explaining to executing is what regular empaths never make. The super empath made it definitively. The final moment came with clarity that was almost peaceful. The super empath wasn't angry when they left, wasn't emotional, wasn't trying to hurt the avoidant. They were just done, completely, exhaustively, irrevocably done. The lack of anger was more devastating to the avoidant than rage would have been, because anger would have meant the super empath was still emotionally engaged. But the calm, clear, peaceful ending meant the super empath had processed everything, had grieved while still in the relationship, had reached the other side of pain and arrived at acceptance. The avoidant was already gone from the super empath's heart before they were gone from the super empath's life. And that internal departure, that emotional completion before the physical separation, meant there was nothing the avoidant could say or do to change the outcome. The decision was final before the avoidant knew a decision was being made. The specific ways the super empath executed their departure. The super empath's departure was surgical in its precision and devastating in its completeness. They didn't do the slow fade. They didn't create drama. They didn't give the avoidant opportunities to talk them out of it. They simply stated the decision clearly and then executed it immediately. The conversation was brief. This relationship doesn't work for me. I've given you multiple opportunities to address the patterns that don't work. You've chosen not to address them. I'm choosing to leave. No long explanation of pain caused, no rehashing of specific incidents, no emotional appeals about what the relationship could be if only the avoidant would change. Just clear statement of fact and clear statement of decision. The brevity was intentional. The super empath understood that long conversations give the avoidant opportunities to manipulate, to make promises they won't keep, to create enough doubt that the person leaving might stay. The super empath left no openings for manipulation. The execution was immediate and complete. The super empath blocked the avoidant everywhere: phone, social media, email. They removed every avenue for contact because they understood that any avenue left open is avenue the avoidant will use to try to restore access. They told mutual friends clearly that they weren't available for updates about the avoidant, weren't interested in hearing what the avoidant was saying, weren't open to being intermediaries. They created boundaries that were impermeable because they understood that avoidants don't respect soft boundaries, that any crack in the boundary is invitation the avoidant will exploit. The completeness of the departure was mercy to themselves and lesson to the avoidant. When you lose a super empath, you lose them entirely, not gradually. The super empath also refused to engage with the avoidant's attempts to restore contact. When the avoidant reached out through the few channels they could still access, when they sent messages through friends, when they tried showing up places they knew the super empath would be, all of it was met with absolute non-engagement. Not anger, not acknowledgement, not explanation. Just absence. The refusal to engage taught the avoidant that their usual tactics didn't work on the super empath. The breadcrumbs that would have pulled a regular empath back in had zero effect. The apologies that usually bought more time were met with silence. The promises to change that typically created enough hope for another chance fell on ears that couldn't hear them because the super empath was completely unavailable for receiving them. The non-engagement was itself a lesson. You don't get to hurt someone repeatedly and then expect them to still be available when you decide you want their attention. The super empath moved forward visibly and deliberately. They didn't hide or diminish themselves after leaving. They posted on social media showing their life was full and happy. They spent time with friends and pursued their interests and generally demonstrated that they were thriving without the avoidant. This wasn't performance for the avoidant's benefit. The super empath genuinely was thriving because leaving had freed energy that maintaining the dysfunctional relationship had been consuming. But the visible thriving taught the avoidant harsh lesson. The super empath wasn't diminished by the ending, wasn't destroyed by losing the avoidant, wasn't incomplete without them. If anything, the super empath was more themselves after leaving than they'd been while staying. The contrast between how the super empath showed up in the relationship, accommodating, patient, slightly diminished, and how they showed up after leaving, vibrant, confident, completely whole, taught the avoidant that they'd been draining the super empath, and the super empath was better off without whatever the relationship was providing. What the avoidant is learning that they'll carry forever. The avoidant is learning that understanding doesn't equal obligation. They're used to empaths staying because empaths understand their trauma, understand their fears, understand why they are the way they are. The avoidant has weaponized their trauma history, has used their attachment wounds as both explanation and excuse, has made their damage into shield against accountability. But the super empath's departure taught them that someone can understand everything about why you're damaged and still refuse to accept being damaged by you. The understanding doesn't create obligation to stay. Understanding doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment. The avoidant thought being understood meant being accepted regardless of behavior. The super empath taught them that being understood clearly is exactly why someone with self-respect would leave. Because understanding your patterns means understanding they won't change without work you're refusing to do. The avoidant is learning that patience has limits even in the most patient people. They thought the super empath's patience was infinite resource they could draw on indefinitely. Every time they pulled away and the super empath stayed, every time they were cold and the super empath offered warmth anyway, every time they failed to meet the super empath's needs and the super empath continued giving anyway, all of this reinforced the avoidant's belief that this person would stay forever, would wait indefinitely, would never actually leave. But patience isn't infinite. It's a resource that depletes when it's not reciprocated, and the super empath's patience depleted completely. The avoidant is learning now, too late, that the most patient person in the world will eventually leave if their patience is exploited rather than appreciated, if it's met with continued dysfunction rather than with effort to change. They're learning that some losses are permanent. The avoidant is used to people coming back. Regular empaths leave, but they usually come back, usually are willing to try again if the avoidant offers minimal effort or makes promises about changing. The avoidant has learned through experience that leaving isn't usually final, it's just leverage, just attempt to get the avoidant to step up, and if the avoidant waits long enough or offers just enough, the person comes back. But the super empath isn't coming back. The avoidant is trying their usual tactics, reaching out with apologies, making promises about therapy, expressing recognition of what they lost. And all of it is meeting impenetrable wall of the super empath's absence. The avoidant is learning that when you lose someone who's actually done their work, who has boundaries that don't negotiate, who chooses themselves over you, the loss is permanent. And permanent loss, when you still want the person, is pain the avoidant has never felt before, because they've always been the one who leaves, always been the one in control of the ending. The avoidant is learning the difference between someone who loved their potential and someone who loved them. Clearly, regular empaths fall in love with the avoidant's potential. The person they could be if they healed, the relationship they could have if the avoidant did their work. And that love of potential keeps regular empaths staying and hoping and waiting for the potential to actualize. But the super empath didn't love potential. They loved the actual avoidant, saw them exactly as they were, understood their limitations intimately. And loving them clearly meant seeing clearly that they were choosing not to grow, choosing their defended state over the relationship, choosing their patterns over partnership. The super empath left not because they stopped loving, but because they loved clearly enough to know that loving someone doesn't mean accepting whatever they offer. The avoidant is learning that being loved clearly by someone with self-respect is more dangerous than being loved for potential. Because being loved clearly means being seen exactly as you are. And if what you are is someone who won't do their work, being seen clearly leads to being left definitively. Why the lesson from the super empath is different from all other losses. The super empath's departure is different from other losses because the super empath never became bitter. They didn't leave angry, didn't leave trying to hurt the avoidant, didn't leave with parting words designed to wound. They left with clarity and compassion for the avoidant's wounds, and clarity that those wounds were the avoidance to heal, not the super empath to absorb. The lack of bitterness makes the loss more haunting because the avoidant can't dismiss the super empath as someone who didn't really understand them or who was too damaged themselves to handle the relationship. The super empath understood perfectly and was healthy enough to leave. That combination, perfect understanding plus healthy departure, is more damning than anger would be. The lesson is also different because the super empath didn't just leave the avoidant, they left better than they arrived. Regular empaths leave depleted, diminished, damaged by the relationship, and the avoidant can take some comfort in that, can tell themselves the person who left was too weak to handle them, was too fragile for the relationship. But the super empath left stronger, more certain of their worth, more clear about their standards. They use the relationship as education about what they'll never accept again, rather than as evidence of their inadequacy. The avoidant is watching someone who they hurt become more powerful because of being hurt, more discerning because of experiencing their dysfunction, more boundaried because of absorbing their limitations. The super empath transformed the pain into growth, and the growth is visible in how they show up after leaving. The avoidant is haunted by the fact that they didn't break the super empath. They just taught them exactly what to avoid in future relationships, which means the avoidant's dysfunction serves the super empath's future while haunting the avoidant's present. This loss is permanent scar because it happened while the avoidant still had feelings. Regular empaths stay until the avoidant's feelings are dead, until the avoidant is ready to leave or indifferent to them leaving. But the super empath left while the avoidant still cared, still wanted them, still could imagine a future together. The timing means the avoidant is stuck with active grief about losing someone they wanted while that person was still available. If only the avoidant had been different. The grief is compounded by recognition that they had every opportunity to be different. The super empath communicated clearly what needed to change, gave the avoidant time and chances and patience. The avoidant chose not to use those opportunities. And living with the knowledge that you lost someone you wanted, through your own choices, through your refusal to do work that would have saved the relationship, is regret that doesn't fade. The lesson is also permanent, because the super empath was the best partner the avoidant has had, or likely will have. The avoidant is discovering this through trying to move forward, trying to date new people, trying to find someone else who offers what the super empath offered. But no one does. New people either don't have the super empath's empathy and understanding, or they have the empathy but lack the boundaries, which makes them regular empaths who the avoidant will drain and lose. The super empath's specific combination, deep empathy plus firm boundaries, is rare, and the avoidant is learning that rarity through its absence. Every new person is comparison to the super empath, and everyone is found wanting. The avoidant is stuck with the super empath as the standard, as the best relationship they've had, as evidence of what they're capable of destroying through their patterns. And being stuck with that knowledge, that you had the best and lost it through being unable to meet it, is permanent diminishment of hope about future relationships. The super empath's final gift to the avoidant. The harsh lesson the super empath taught was actually gift, though the avoidant won't recognize it as gift for years, if ever. The gift is truth delivered without cruelty. You are not capable of healthy relationship in your current state. Your patterns will destroy anything good you find, until you do deep therapeutic work. And understanding your trauma doesn't obligate anyone to absorb the damage your unhealed trauma creates. This truth, delivered through the super empath's departure rather than through words the avoidant could dismiss, is only truth that has chance of penetrating the avoidant's defenses. The avoidant can rationalize away conversations, they can dismiss verbal feedback, but they can't rationalize away the super empath's absence. They can't dismiss the lesson of losing someone who understood them completely and left anyway. The gift is also in what the super empath didn't do. They didn't stay until they hated the avoidant. They didn't stay until the relationship destroyed them. They didn't stay until they were so depleted they left as shell of themselves. They left while they still had enough self to leave well, to leave cleanly, to leave in ways that modeled what the avoidant should aspire to. The capacity to choose yourself, to enforce boundaries that protect you, to leave situations that harm you regardless of love or history. The super empath's departure was masterclass in self-respect, and watching someone execute boundaries that protect themselves is education the avoidant needed, even though they didn't want it. The final gift is that the super empath's departure creates only circumstance where the avoidant might actually change. As long as the super empath was staying, the avoidant had no reason to change. The super empath's patience was enabling the avoidance patterns, was making dysfunction sustainable, was preventing natural consequences that might motivate growth. But the super empath leaving, the permanent loss of someone the avoidant valued, the recognition that patterns cost them something irreplaceable. These are consequences that might possibly drive the avoidant to finally pursue the therapy they've been avoiding, to do the work they've been refusing, to become capable of the intimacy they claim to want. The super empath's departure is the wake-up call the avoidant needed. Whether the avoidant will wake up is their choice. But the alarm has been sounded loudly and clearly through the most powerful teacher the avoidant will ever encounter. The natural consequence of losing someone exceptional through being unwilling to meet them. The super empath taught the avoidant a harsh lesson they will never forget, that empathy has limits, that understanding doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that patience without reciprocity eventually ends, that someone can see all of you and still decide you're not worth the cost in your current state. The lesson was delivered through perfect execution, through boundaries that didn't negotiate, through departure that was final, through absence that was complete. And the lesson is permanent, because the super empath left while they were still strong, still clear, still capable of thriving without the avoidant. The avoidant will carry this loss forever, will compare everyone to the super empath and find everyone wanting, will recognize too late that they had someone rare who would have stayed if the avoidant had done their work, but who was too healthy to stay while the avoidant refused to grow. That's the lesson, that's the loss, that's the permanent scar the super empath left on someone who thought empaths were easy to drain and discard. The super empath taught them differently, taught them lastingly, taught them in the only language the avoidance defended psychology can understand, through the devastation of permanent loss of someone who truly understood them and chose themselves anyway. What the avoidant does with the lesson determines their entire future. The harsh lesson the super empath taught is now sitting in the avoidant's psyche like a stone they can't swallow and can't spit out. What they do with this lesson, whether they use it as catalyst for transformation or as confirmation of their worst beliefs about themselves and relationships, will determine the trajectory of their entire relational future. Some avoidants, a rare few, will let the pain of losing the super empath drive them into the therapy they've been avoiding for years. They'll finally make the call, finally schedule the appointment, finally commit to the uncomfortable work of examining their attachment wounds and developing capacity they don't currently have. For these avoidants, the super empath's departure becomes the bottom that finally motivates change. The loss so devastating that it breaks through decades of defensiveness and forces confrontation with patterns that have been destroying every relationship they've valued. These avoidants will do the work, will spend years in therapy unpacking their trauma, will slowly and painfully develop ability to tolerate vulnerability and intimacy. And when they do, when they finally become capable of healthy relationship, they'll recognize that the super empath's departure was the gift that saved them from wasting their entire life in defended isolation. But most avoidants don't respond to the lesson this way. Most respond by hardening further, by building higher walls, by telling themselves that the super empath leaving proves that relationships don't work, that people can't be trusted, that vulnerability leads to pain. These avoidants take the lesson and invert it. Instead of learning that their patterns destroy relationships, they learn that relationships are inherently destructive and they were right to be defended. Instead of recognizing that the super empath left because the avoidant wouldn't do their work, they convince themselves the super empath left because empaths always leave eventually, because no one can truly accept them, because their damage makes them unlovable. The defensive interpretation protects them from having to face their role in the loss, protects them from the shame of recognizing they destroyed something precious through their own choices. And the protection is immediate, but the cost is their entire future. They'll go through life destroying relationship after relationship, losing everyone who gets close enough to matter, accumulating losses that confirm the defensive narrative they built after losing the super empath. There's also a third category, the avoidants who understand the lesson intellectually, but can't translate understanding into action. These avoidants know they need therapy, know their patterns are the problem, know they lost the super empath through their own limitations. But knowing doesn't create enough motivation to overcome the terror of therapeutic work. They understand what they should do, but they're too scared to do it. So they stay stuck in the middle, aware enough to feel shame about their patterns, but not brave enough to change those patterns, conscious enough to recognize they're destroying their life, but not capable enough to build different life. These avoidants are the most tortured because they can't retreat into defensive narratives that protect them from responsibility. But they also can't move forward into growth that would free them from their patterns. They're trapped in awareness without transformation, understanding without capacity, recognition without action. And this middle space, knowing you're the problem but being unable to solve the problem, is its own special hell that the super empath's clarity has locked them into. The specific ways the super empath's absence continues teaching long after the departure. The teaching doesn't end when the super empath leaves. It continues through their permanent absence, through every moment the avoidant wishes they could reach out and can't, through every situation where they want the super empath's perspective or support or presence and have to face that they've permanently lost access to those things. The continued absence is continued lesson. When you lose someone who has boundaries, you lose them completely, not gradually. There's no friendship option, no casual contact, no way to keep the person in your life at reduced capacity. The all or nothing quality of the loss teaches the avoidant that the super empath meant what they said about the relationship not working. That the boundaries around the ending are as firm as the boundaries around everything else. That there will be no chances to ease the avoidant's conscience through demonstrating they've changed or apologizing more adequately. The super empath's continued absence also teaches through comparison. Every person the avoidant dates after the super empath is measured against what the super empath provided, and everyone falls short in specific ways that teach specific lessons. New partners either don't have the super empath's depth of understanding, which teaches the avoidant how rare it is to be truly understood, or new partners have empathy but lack boundaries, which teaches the avoidant how unusual the super empath's combination was. Deep empathy that never became self-abandonment. Or new partners have boundaries but lack the super empath's patience and grace, which teaches the avoidant that the super empath gave them time and chances that most people won't give. Each comparison is education about what the avoidant lost, about how special the super empath was, about how unlikely it is they'll find that combination of qualities again. And the education through comparison is more effective than any words, because it's delivered through lived experience of dating after the super empath and discovering that what they had was irreplaceable. The absence continues teaching through the avoidant's own emotional experience over time. Immediately after the super empath leaves, the avoidant might feel relief. The pressure is off. They don't have to manage someone else's needs. They're free. But relief is temporary. What follows is grief that deepens rather than fading because the avoidant is recognizing progressively what they lost. Months after the super empath leaves, the avoidant is understanding things about the relationship they didn't understand while it was happening. They're recognizing how much the super empath accommodated, how patient the super empath was, how many chances they were given that they didn't deserve. The delayed understanding creates delayed grief, and delayed grief is particularly painful because it arrives after the loss is permanent, after there's no possibility of repair, after the recognition comes too late to change anything. The super empath's absence is teaching the avoidant about what they had through the experience of living without it and discovering that life without it is significantly diminished. The teaching through absence also includes the avoidant learning about their own capacity for attachment. The avoidant built their identity on not needing people, on being comfortable alone, on not being affected by relationship outcomes. But the super empath's permanent absence is revealing that the identity was false. The avoidant does need people. Specifically, they needed the super empath. They're not comfortable alone. They're lonely in ways that aren't being filled by their defended independence. They are affected by this relationship outcome, affected profoundly painfully in ways that aren't fading with time. The super empath's absence is forcing the avoidant to confront that everything they believed about themselves is lie constructed to manage their fear of need and dependency. And confronting that your entire identity is defensive fiction is destabilizing in ways that might lead to growth or might lead to deeper defensiveness. But either way, the confrontation is happening because the super empath's absence is too impactful to ignore or minimize. How the super empath's departure changed them permanently. The super empath who left the avoidant is not the same person who entered the relationship with them. The relationship transformed them, and the transformation is permanent upgrade in their capacity to protect themselves. They learned to recognize avoidant patterns early, the hot and cold behavior, the withdrawal when intimacy deepens, the words that don't match actions, the promises without follow-through. These patterns, that took them months to recognize with the avoidant, will be visible within weeks with anyone new who exhibits them. The super empath's pattern recognition has been calibrated through painful experience, and the calibration protects them from ever being in relationship with another avoidant for as long as they were with this one. They'll see the signs, they'll trust what they're seeing, and they'll leave before deep attachment forms. The super empath also learned about their own boundaries in ways that permanently changed their standards. They learned that patience without reciprocity depletes rather than builds relationship. They learned that understanding someone's wounds doesn't obligate accepting being wounded by them. They learned that empathy is a gift to be offered to people who appreciate it, not to people who exploit it. All of these lessons are now integrated into the super empath's relational operating system. They'll never again stay as long with someone who's not meeting them. They'll never again make excuses for treatment that hurts them just because they understand why the person is hurting them. They'll never again give their empathy to someone who uses that empathy as license to avoid doing their own work. The avoidant taught the super empath these lessons through being the last person who will ever get away with patterns that the super empath now knows are unacceptable. The departure also strengthened the super empath's trust in themselves. They learned they can make hard decisions and stick to them even when their heart wants to go back. They learned they can sit with the discomfort of not knowing how the avoidant is doing, not being available to help, not softening their boundaries even when they miss the person. They learned they can choose themselves over someone they love, can prioritize their well-being over someone else's feelings, can be what might look like selfish to others but is actually self-preservation. The trust in their own judgment, in their ability to enforce their boundaries, in their capacity to survive loss. All of this is now proven through lived experience. The super empath knows they can do hard things because they did the hardest thing. They left someone they loved because loving them was costing too much. That knowledge is power they'll carry into every future decision. The transformation also includes the super empath developing immunity to manipulation tactics they were vulnerable to before. The avoidant tried everything to get the super empath to stay or to return after leaving. Apologies, promises, explanations about their trauma, expressions of recognition about what they lost. None of it worked because the super empath had learned to evaluate people by their patterns over time rather than by their words in the moment. The immunity to manipulation that developed through being manipulated and learning to recognize and resist it means the super empath is now significantly harder to control, to gaslight, to convince to accept less than they deserve. They've been through the experience of having someone use their empathy against them, and having survived it and learned from it, they're now protected against anyone else trying the same tactics. The ripple effects of the super empath's lesson reaching beyond the avoidant. The lesson the super empath taught doesn't just affect the avoidant. It ripples out to affect everyone in the avoidant's life, and everyone in the super empath's life. The avoidant's friends and family witnessed the departure, and many of them saw clearly what the avoidant couldn't see. That the super empath was exceptional, that the relationship ended because of the avoidant's patterns, that the avoidant lost someone rare through being unable to meet them. Some of these friends and family members have been telling the avoidant for years that they need therapy, that their patterns are destructive, that they're going to end up alone if they don't change. But the avoidant dismissed these observations as judgmental or as people not understanding them. The super empath leaving, someone who understood them completely and left anyway, is validation of what friends and family have been saying all along. The avoidant can't dismiss the super empath's departure the way they dismissed others' concerns. And friends and family are now less willing to enable the avoidant's defensive narratives, more likely to be direct about the avoidant needing professional help, less tolerant of the avoidant's refusal to take responsibility for their patterns. The super empath's departure also teaches everyone in the super empath's life about the importance of boundaries and self-respect. Friends who watched the super empath stay longer than they should have, who were concerned about the toll the relationship was taking, who wanted the super empath to leave before they did, all of these people witnessed the eventual departure and saw how the super empath executed it. They saw the boundaries, the finality, the refusal to engage with attempts at manipulation, and watching someone they care about enforce boundaries that protect them is education in how to do the same. The super empath's friends are learning through observation that you can leave people you love when loving them is harming you, that having empathy doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that understanding someone's damage doesn't mean letting them damage you. The ripple effect is the super empath's entire social circle becoming more boundaried, more protective of themselves, more willing to leave situations that don't serve them. The lesson is also affecting future partners of both the avoidant and the super empath in opposite ways. Future partners of the avoidant are benefiting from the lesson if the avoidant learned from it. If the avoidant actually pursued therapy after losing the super empath, future partners get the transformed version who can finally do intimacy and vulnerability. But if the avoidant didn't learn, future partners are inheriting the hardened version. The avoidant who's now more defended, more convinced that people leave eventually, more guarded against ever letting anyone get as close as the super empath got. Either way, the super empath's departure is determining what future partners will encounter. Meanwhile, future partners of the super empath are benefiting regardless. They're getting someone with clear boundaries, strong self-respect, refined pattern recognition, and proven capacity to leave when treatment doesn't meet standards. The super empath's future partners are inheriting the upgraded version, the person who learned from pain how to protect themselves better. The permanent imprint of being understood and still being rejected. What haunts the avoidant most about losing the super empath is not that they were left, but that they were fully understood and still rejected. Most people who leave avoidance don't understand them. They're frustrated by the avoidance behavior, but they don't understand where it comes from. They don't see the wounds driving the patterns. And not being understood provides the avoidant with defensive explanation for the ending. The person who left just didn't get them, didn't understand their complexity, didn't have patience for their process. But the super empath understood everything. They saw the wounds clearly. They recognized the fear driving every withdrawal. They understood the avoidance patterns better than the avoidant understood their own patterns. And they left anyway. Being understood completely and still being rejected is verdict the avoidant can't appeal. It means someone saw all of them, including the parts they hide from most people, and decided that all of them wasn't enough, wasn't worth staying for, wasn't sufficient to build a life with. This particular quality of rejection that comes after being fully known, creates shame in the avoidant that other rejections don't create. When someone leaves without understanding you, you can tell yourself they didn't see the real you. They didn't give you a fair chance. They judged you without knowing you. But when someone understands you completely and leaves, the only conclusion is that the real you, fully known, is someone who's not worth staying for. The super empath saw the avoidance trauma and still held them accountable for their behavior. The super empath recognized the avoidance limitations and still refused to accept being limited by them. The super empath understood the avoidance fear and still prioritized their own well-being over accommodating that fear. Every element of the super empath's understanding came paired with refusal to let that understanding compromise their standards. And that pairing, I see you clearly and I'm leaving anyway, is most damning judgment the avoidant has ever received. The imprint this creates is permanent because it can't be rationalized away. The avoidant can't tell themselves the super empath didn't give them a fair chance. The super empath gave them months or years of chances. They can't tell themselves the super empath didn't understand their struggles. The super empath understood better than anyone. They can't tell themselves the super empath was too demanding or had unrealistic expectations. The super empath's expectations were basic requirements for partnership that the avoidant simply refused to meet. Every defensive narrative the avoidant tries to construct to protect themselves from responsibility for the loss falls apart under examination. Because the super empath's understanding was too complete, the chances given were too many. The patience extended was too generous. The avoidant is left with no defense except the truth. They were understood fully and loved anyway, and they lost that love through their refusal to do the work that loving someone back would have required. The final truth about super empaths and the avoidants who lose them. The final truth is that super empaths are rare enough that most avoidants only encounter one, maybe two in their lifetime. The specific combination of deep empathy, strong boundaries, capacity to see through defenses, patience that has limits, and strength to leave while still strong. This combination is unusual. Most empaths lack the boundaries. Most boundaried people lack the depth of empathy. The super empath is intersection of these qualities, and the intersection is rare. When an avoidant loses a super empath, they're not just losing a relationship. They're losing their best chance at having someone who could have helped them heal, if they'd been willing to do their work, someone who could have loved them through their transformation if transformation was something they'd pursued. The loss is loss of possibility, loss of the partner who was most equipped to handle their limitations while requiring growth from them. The final truth is also that super empaths don't look back once they're gone. Regular empaths leave, but they often return, often give more chances, often allow themselves to be pulled back in through the avoidance promises or apologies or expressions of regret. But super empaths leave once, finally, and they don't return. The decision to leave is made after so much deliberation, after so much data collection, after so much internal work preparing for departure. that by the time they leave, there's nothing the avoidant can say or do to change their mind. The super empath has already considered everything the avoidant might say in their defense. They've already imagined the promises the avoidant might make. They've already processed the guilt they might feel about leaving. All of it was worked through before the departure, which means the departure is end of a process, not beginning of negotiation. The avoidant waiting for the super empath to come back, hoping their apologies will work eventually, expecting that the super empath will soften. All of this is delusion. The super empath is gone permanently, and the permanence is the final lesson. Some decisions can't be undone. Some losses can't be recovered from. Some people leave and never return. The super empath taught the avoidant a harsh lesson they will never forget. That empathy without self-abandonment is force that can't be controlled, that being understood completely doesn't protect you from consequences, that someone can see all your wounds and still refuse to be wounded by you, that the most patient person in the world will eventually leave if their patience is exploited rather than appreciated. The lesson was harsh because it needed to be. Nothing gentle would have penetrated the avoidance defenses. Nothing kind would have created impact sufficient to maybe, possibly, motivate change. The super empath taught through leaving, through absence, through permanent withdrawal of everything the avoidant had taken for granted. And whether the avoidant learns from the lesson or hardens against it, whether they use the loss as catalyst for transformation or as confirmation of their defended worldview. The lesson has been delivered with clarity that can't be misunderstood. You cannot treat people this way and expect them to stay. You cannot refuse to grow and expect to keep people who are growing. You cannot love from defended distance and expect someone healthy to accept that as sufficient. The super empath taught the lesson. The avoidant's entire future depends on whether they can finally, after all this loss, learn it.